It was supposed to be a quiet weekend. Me, my girlfriend Anna, and our two friends, Leo and Sam, we drove deep into Pine Ridge Forest with cooler, tents, and a foolish confidence. The trail climbed through pines that kept their needles like secrets, and by late afternoon the sky had folded into a high, clear blue. We found a flat hollow by a creek and claimed it as if it were private property. 3 tents set in a loose semicircle, a ring of stones for the fire, backpacks leaned like sleeping animals. The first night was ordinary. We ate burnt marshmallows and told jokes that smelled faintly of bravado. At maybe midnight the forest changed its pattern. The insects stopped, as if someone had slid a hand across a radio dial and pushed the noise out. The wind that had been a constant presence folded away. Silence sat on us like a weight. I remember the quiet because it made the campfire a voice. Every pop and hiss sounded like a punctuation. We were making plans to sleep when Leo said, quietly, "You guys hear that?" It started soft, a twig snapping, a scuff like a boot where brush met trunk. Then, layered under that, a sound that was not quite a footstep, a heavy shifting that moved in a slow circumference around our light. We shined our headlamps outward and the beams cut only trees, the white cylinders stopping at trunks, revealing nothing. Then the breaking of a branch, closer this time, neat and precise. Anna laughed at first, too loud, because someone has to laugh in the face of the unknown. We called out, half in anger, half in childish game, "Whoever you are, show yourself." The answering silence did not feel empty, it felt deliberate. I slept poorly in spurts, one eye open like a sentry. Around 2 the sounds resumed, soft footfalls pacing the edge of our light, then longer steps that retreated. At dawn Leo discovered a print by the fire pit. Immense, nearly 16 inches across, spread like the palm of something that weighed more than its size suggested. 5 toe impressions printed deep in the damp earth, each ending with a sharp crescent as if claws had curled. None of our boots matched it. None of our sensible theories could explain it. We packed silent and fast, the air between us full of things unspoken. As we shouldered our packs I glanced at the rear windshield of my car and saw letters traced in the grime, "See you soon." The words were careful, small, as if whoever had written them had used a fingertip that considered its form. We left the woods without looking back. Even now, the memory of that footprint hangs at the corner of my sleep like a shape I almost recognize, and my feet itch with the habit of checking shadows when the wind drops. We debated about going back the night after, standing in my kitchen with coffee that did nothing for the hollowness. Curiosity is a dangerous companion. It asks in the voice of reason but carries the footfalls of compulsion. Leo wanted to go back with cameras and better lights, to prove the world was still sensible. Anna hated the idea. Sam shrugged and said he'd go if Leo paid for gas. In the end we returned 2 days later, in daylight, with an old camcorder and boots that scuffed more than they followed. The pines looked ordinary in the sun. Shadows rearranged into harmless lanes between trunks. The spiral of stones was still there but less crisp, weather had circled it with its own erasure. The print was gone though imprints remained like a bruise in the turf where it had been. We stayed near the cleared camp until sundown, forced ourselves to laugh and make hot dogs over a polite, unimpressive fire. As night settled and the insects resumed their chorus, the silence returned like a remembered thing. At 3 in the morning our headlamps caught motion past the line of low brush, something that moved without a sound the way a trained predator does. It did not run, it flowed with a soft deliberation. Leo fumbled the camcorder and the footage when we watched it back later had interruptions. A smear, a long dark arm moving through the frame, and then a point of white that might have been an eye. The battery died at a single click. After that night, our group frayed. Anna stopped being playful. Sam took to driving with a baseball bat across his lap, as if possession of a tool might hold back a concept. Leo tried to turn the memory into humor when friends asked. He joked about forest telegrams, but when he drank alone he would stare at his hands and count. We all had sketches in our heads, versions of the figure, and none of them fit a single frame. I have returned to Pine Ridge alone once, years later, at a slow hour when the sun was a thin coin. The forest there kept the same pace, slow, patient. I walked to the hollow by the creek and sat until the sun fell like a cautious blade. I left a small stone near the circle of pebbles and walked away. Some part of me wanted the land to know I had not forgotten. Forgetting felt like a breach. I do not mean to claim the forest as a conscious thing. I only say that the place keeps events in a way that people notice. Perhaps it is that we mark it and it remembers us back. Sometimes I imagine that what we saw in Pine Ridge was a ripple from something older than our own small decisions. I read about old logging routes and ghost towns whose names live only as angles on a paper map. Maybe the forest holds those angles tight and returns them when someone walks the line. On an autumn afternoon years later, I met a woman at a roadside diner who claimed to have a photo of a similar footprint from her grandmother's travel journal. It was sepia and blurred, but the shape mirrored the one we had seen, huge, five-toed, carved deep into damp ground. She slid the picture across and watched my face. Some places keep pace with themselves, she said. I do not know what to do with that meeting except fold it into the rest of my nights. I don't become reckless because of it, I become careful. When friends ask why I sometimes refuse to sleep with the windows open, or why I avoid a certain route after sunset, I tell them I don't like circles. I think what I learned most clearly is that the woods keep a memory in texture, a footprint in mud, the arrangement of rocks, a message in grime on glass. Those small textures can become a language if you listen long enough. My cousin James loved camping alone because it gave him a kind of private altar, a place to take himself apart and put himself back together on his own terms. The last time he signed out at the ranger station in Deep Hollow, he moved with that calm air people carry when they intend to be back on time. He was meticulous, a map folded into the front pocket, a bright orange top, a headlamp with fresh batteries. He told the clerk he'd return Sunday. They found his site 2 days later. The tent was pitched right, the sleeping bag rolled with favor, a plate of cold ramen sat near the camp stove, and a ring of ash marked where the fire had been tended. James was gone. No gear was missing and the camp showed no sign of struggle. The camera on his tripod had been left recording stills at intervals. The sequence of photos read like a normal night: stars, the fire's glow, a backlit silhouette as he moved to stoke flames, until the image at 2:13 a.m. The last frame pictured his tent under a pale blue wash, and at the far left edge a smear of something pale that might have been a face, half hidden by sapwood and shadow. The search dogs followed no human scent from the campsite. The tracking seemed to end where the trees thickened. They did find prints deeper in the hollow, several small bare impressions, toes splayed. They led for a short distance and then simply stopped, as if the maker had closed a book on the world and stepped out of the page. Local hunters told whispered versions, someone waiting by the creek, or a child who had once been lost near those oaks. My aunt cried quietly for a week and then planted a small cedar beside our lawn and started sleeping with a soft light on. James's pack sits at the back of my cousin's closet, still taut with the zipper closed, a ghostly vote in fabric. My cousin's disappearance turned our family into unsettled men circling a rumor. We aced the practical parts, calling search and rescue, speaking with rangers, checking grid coordinates, but there are questions that do not fit protocol. Where does a person go when the trail ends and the prints stop? At the funeral, people muttered that sometimes the wild takes what it will, and sometimes it hides what it takes. I remember standing at the graveside imagining lines on a map folding like paper, the folds burying roots that had been obvious. In the months that followed, strangers rang my aunt late at night with stories that started with "I don't mean to bother you but," and then told of a man they swore had smiled on a path and then not been there when they glanced back. Old-timers at the diner muttered about a hollow man that children used to warn each other about. Once we went back with a small team of friends to pace and measure the hollow. The oak trees there were older than memory and their roots tangled like a web. We found small charms woven into bark, strips of cloth tied where branches dipped low, and on one low limb a child's mitten, crusted with the sort of dirt that suggested it had been there a long time and not long at all. Someone put the mitten back where it had been, and the group walked away quieter than they'd come. I keep James's last recorded still in my phone, though I don't watch it often. Sometimes at night the edges of the image seem to move, a breath in the black margin. If you were to ask me whether I believe in ghosts or in an explanation that keeps to the natural world, I'd say both can share a room. It's possible that someone with patience and a taste for mischief staged the scene. It's possible the forest kept a scrap and would not give it back. Both explanations feel like consolation in different sizes. As months passed, our family learned to tolerate the unanswered in small rituals. Every summer, my aunt would take a walk along the edge of the hollow, carrying a thermos and a plastic chair, and she would sit there for 20 minutes, sometimes longer. She would leave small things, buttons, a scrap of ribbon tied to low branches. If you make a mark, she told me once, something can find its way back to you. The idea is not rational, but grief is a kind of language that thrives on acts. I went back alone one autumn with a metal detector, a foolish plan borrowed from a novel. The machine whirred and complained as if disturbed by the earth. It picked up nothing but an animal nail and some aluminum from an old can. Still, feeling silly did not mean the place offered comfort. There was the hollow, and there were the sweet and rotten smells of fallen fruit and condensation. At the base of an oak I found a tiny folded paper, brittle with age. I did not open it at first. I sat and watched as the valley pulled colors down to dusk. Later I unfolded the paper and found the child's loop of scribble that might have been a name. I kept that scrap until the coffee tasted bitter and the sun had dropped, and when I left I slipped it back into the bark as if returning a coin. The search for James never did bring him back. We moved through routines that educated sorrow into schedule. Yet sometimes, late at night, my aunt would call and say she had been walking and had thought she saw a figure near the water. Maybe it was a deer, she'd say. But we both knew she had moved into a language where sight and desire collude. That small tragedy taught us that the line between explanation and mystery is porous, and that the best we can do is keep making small memorials and listening for whistling in the hollow. Mirror Lake promised the kind of night you tell your city friends about. The water was still and the trees held each reflection like a secret-making companion. My brother Nate and I hiked to its bank as dusk fell, carrying only the essentials and the arrogance of men who believed a map and a compass were enough to keep them honest. We settled by the shore and the world quartered itself into fire, lake, star, and the dark line of trees. Sometime after midnight, while the logs were cooling, I woke to scraping metal against wood, thin, deliberate. Across the lake, where the other shore should have been a black seam, a cabin's window flashed a small light. It pulsed once and vanished. The air over the water tasted like cold tin. In the morning we found a path of shallow footprints leading to a patch of reeds and then nothing. We crossed by a narrow ford and came upon a cabin tucked between moss and leaning pines, wood grey as wet paper, and a door hung loose. The interior smelled like dust and the slow sweetness of paper left unopened. I remember the way the floorboards complained as we moved. And then there were the plates, too, set in the center of the table, steam faintly rising. Toast not yet cooled, eggs that trembled with freshness. The cutlery beside them had small water beading along their edges, as if they had just been used. It felt obscene to be there. We left without apology and the air behind us hummed with the knowledge that some rooms keep their occupants by habit. The ranger who later answered our call said, flatly, that no cabin was registered on that side of the lake and that any structure would have been visible on the aerial maps. He added the kind of soft warning you say when you do not mean to frighten but have no good way to reassure. Some places are only sometimes there. We never took a night walk by a lake again without thinking the dark held more than water. After we left the cabin, every map we pulled up showed only water and forest. No structure, no foundation, nothing. We argued until the cold in our fingers became distraction enough not to argue. Nate was the practical one, the sort who would laugh at superstitions over coffee and then not say anything when the night made them literal. He swore we had left plates, then paused and admitted he had only wanted to leave the place tidy in case some other traveler came by. That summer I developed a habit of walking lakes at dusk. The shorelines seemed to keep secrets on long loops and eventually the habit made me careful. I asked around, fishermen, seasonal workers, anyone who had been on those campsites. A man at the marina brightened as if he had remembered a story then dimmed. People talk about what the lake gives and what the lake keeps, he said. Sometimes you find the echo of your own life waiting on the other side. Months later, on a winter afternoon, the ranger called to say someone else reported a cabin light across Mirror Lake. We drove up in a car that complained about the cold. The cabin was there for that brief view, an outline like a ghost of beams, and it winked out as we watched, as if embarrassed by being noticed. I learned to trust my eyes and to trust that some places simply do not want to be catalogued. We still fish the lake in daylight and keep a respectful distance from the far shore. We tried to document the cabin with photography and thrown stones. Usual tactics failed. The wood seemed to take in the pebble like a sponge and offered nothing back. A friend who studied local history dug into old survey maps and found, with a kind of clinical satisfaction, a notation from 50 years prior. Structure removed, then nothing. The absence of a building is still documentation. It is a letter that says layered things. Late that summer, when the air carried the sour scent of late berries, Nate and I returned to Mirror Lake with a small radio, tuned for static. We sat and listened to the night, to the slow breaths of frogs and the small argot of insects. At 3 a.m, the static on the radio hardened into a thin, high note that lasted only for a second. We both recorded the sound on our phones, but when we played it back, the high note was a human breath and a low, wrong frequency that the microphones could not hold. The people we later told tended to smile as if to make grief respectable, but the 2 plates on that cabin table stayed like a question that resists grammar. I sometimes think the lake is a place that remembers hospitality and resentments with equal appetite. It holds stillness like a cup and sometimes returns a taste of the people who have been there, as if memory has its own weather. The storm came on faster than the forecast, as if the sky had been holding its breath until it could not bear it. We were on a ridge in northern Colorado, my college friends and I, cramped in a tent that billowed with wind. Rain hammered the canvas and the thunder flung answers against the mountain. Around midnight, the tent shivered with a sound like voices that had learned to lean together. They were not shouts or speech but a layered whisper, syllables braided into insistence. It started as a murmur and then my name Eli, clean and clear, spoken with a cadence that made my skin push in small gooseflesh. The voice outside was soft and shaped into invitation. Eli, come out. My stomach squeezed with a cold tide. I nudged Luke. He was awake and pale. We lay absolutely still while the sound circled our tent like a hand feeling for a seam. Then the fabric of the tent began to bulge in places where a face might press. Soft outlines, tall and wrong in proportion, a suggestion of shoulders. When lightning cracked and the inside of the tent went white for a breath, I saw an elongated forehead and the hint of eyes set too wide. The silhouette flattened with the wind and vanished. In the early light, the exterior of the tent bore marks, pale rings scorched into the weave as if fingers that had been hotter than flame had pressed against the canvas and left memory as a burn. We showed the ranger the marks and he closed his mouth for a long time before he said, "It's been seen before. People call it the whispering. They come for short times and then go. Folks who camp here know to check their zippers twice and to leave a light on." We did not ask him what they were or why they chose names. We did not want to hear if someone had ever answered. Those nights changed small things in us. We lock our tents extra tight now, and when the wind falls silent we speak aloud to keep the dark from prefacing our names. Sometimes, when I am alone in a quiet room, a syllable on the wind will pull at a memory like a string. I stop, listen, and say, "I'm here," to the empty air, if only to prove to myself that my voice still belongs to me. The whispering ridgeline gave us a small superstition to carry: never answer a name called in the tent, never slide a zipper without someone else seeing. We told these rules with laughter at first, to soften them, but laughter sometimes can't hold the memory of a voice that calls you as if it had been waiting. My friends stopped taking solo trips. When the wind is wrong now, flat and held like a hand, I text the group and tell them the ridge is breathing. On a return trip 3 years later, I drove past the ridge at dusk and found lanterns hung along the trail like a vigil. Locals said the lights had been there a week, left by people who had once been strangers and now call themselves watchers. They said the name calling still happens, but that the calling seems less eager when the lights burn. The idea that a simple flame could change the mood of a mountain pleased me and annoyed the part of me that wanted purely rational answers. Still, I have never forgotten the shape that flattened itself to our tent, nor the way a spoken syllable could press into me like a finger. If memory is a territory we revisit, then those nights are an area on my map marked with the color of caution. The whispering nights taught me to treat names as if they were small candles. You do not blow a candle out and say you are glad of the dark. You keep a small light beside your bed. We started to keep one cheap lead on in the tent, to leave it on until the air warmed at dawn. In the long term, the group made new rules: always camp with neighbors within earshot, keep a charged phone in a waterproof bag, and leave a note at the ranger station if you plan to stay after sunset. On my last visit, I decided to drive the ridge when the sky was an uncertain color, half storm and half evening, because living with a story that mutely pulls at your sleeve is worse than visiting and seeing it closed. I wanted to make a kind of ritual of arriving, an offering of attention with the hope it might undo the weight of memory. The road to the ridge tightened like a fist, flanked by hedgerow and the occasional gate for property I had never heard of. As I parked and shouldered my pack, the wind tasted of wet iron and late-blooming clover. I walked the old trail with a small light on low beam that I kept at my chest so it would not be obtrusive. The lantern's halo rested on stones and the occasional moss-covered root, and I felt less like an intruder and more like a guest who had arrived at the household when everyone else was asleep. Midway up the incline, I passed a circle of tiny candles, cheap tea lights sunk into the ground and protected by small glass jars. Someone had left them with an economy that suggested the task had been done often. No ceremony, simply a chain of light. A note was tucked under one jar, and my heart did a stupid, small leap when I read it. For those who answer the night. Whoever had written it had capitulated to tenderness in handwriting that trembled a little at the edges. I left my stone next to the jar and said, aloud, a brief sentence of thanks for the place. It felt foolish and also necessary. The wind moved differently there, like someone rearranging curtains. At one point I thought I heard a whisper, but it might have been the creek wearing the rocks thin. The ridge kept nothing grand to give me. It did not produce anew the print or the figure I had once feared. What it did do was accept an apology of sorts from me, an acknowledgement that not all places are neutral and that some keep a ledger of small events. I sat for a while and watched a moth fly between candlelight and darkness and thought about how fragile my certainty had been for so long. On the drive back, I stopped at a small diner where a few locals sat nursing coffee as if it were a serious religion. They looked up when I entered, and one of the women, the one whose hands had blisters from a life of work, nudged the man beside her and nodded toward me, as if she could see the small stone in my pocket. "You camp up on the ridge?" she asked without preamble. I said yes, and she shrugged as if to demystify the entire thing. "It remembers people," she said. "So we remember it." Her explanation was not meant to frighten me. It was pragmatic and oddly comforting, a civic grace from someone who had lived a life that needed fewer metaphors. I told her about the lights and the jar note and how I had left a stone. She smiled in a way that suggested she had done the same many times in many places. "We keep a light," she said. "We put a thing down and the ridge is less hungry." I thanked her and left feeling a quiet that was not the same as relief but rather a reconciliation, an acceptance that small acts can be the stitches that mend where memory frays. If you ever find yourself sleeping under canvas and the night slices open in a way that makes you suspect you've been noted by something else, take the smallest action you can, a light, a scrap of fabric, a stone. Not because it will make the strange vanish, but because it helps. As I drove away from the diner, the sky split with a single, clean lightning and then settled as if nothing had happened, and I realized how easily the world returns to a state where things look as if they had never occurred. Memory, I think, is what we carry from the ridge. It is a small bundle of moments we carry. Sometimes we spend them, sometimes we keep them. Keep a light near, bring someone with you.